Blood always smells like old pennies and bad decisions. Fiona knew the scent intimately. So when 4 muscle-bound operators barged into her emergency room, treating the trauma bay like a local dive bar and making height jokes, she didn't get angry. She just leaned in and whispered the one word they thought nobody knew. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a dying, erratic hum in Trauma Bay, 3 casting a sickly greenish pallor over the linoleum. Fiona rubbed the bridge of her nose, her fingers slick with a thin film of cheap hospital hand sanitizer and residual sweat. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Friday, the witching hour in the Virginia Beach Emergency Department. The air in the room was thick, a stifling cocktail of bleach copper stale vomit and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Her feet, encased in scuffed clogs that offered 0 arch support, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that matched her heartbeat. She was running on 3 hours of fractured sleep and half a cup of lukewarm acidic coffee. Automatic doors hissed open at the end of the hall, followed by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots. Fiona didn't need to look up from the chart she was updating to know what was coming. The swagger always preceded them. 4 men spilled into the triage area. They smelled of salt water, damp neoprene cheap beer, and that distinct, sharp odor of unspent aggression. They were massive, their shoulders too broad for the narrow hospital corridors, their faces painted with the arrogant invincibility unique to men who jumped out of planes for a living. Navy SEALs. Fiona had treated enough of them to recognize the breed. They treated injuries like temporary inconveniences and civilians like background extras in their own personal action movies. "Hey, sweetheart!" The loudest one barked, leaning heavily on the triage desk. He was a slab of muscle with a jawline that looked like it had been chiseled out of concrete. Blood soaked the left sleeve of his grey t-shirt, dripping steadily onto the scuffed floor tiles. "Got a little scratch that needs some superglue. Try to find someone who knows what they're doing." Fiona didn't flinch. She slowly capped her pen, her movements deliberate and devoid of urgency. She looked at the blood pooling near his combat boots, then up at his face. "Trauma Bay 3. Walk yourself there before you bleed out on my floor. I just mopped." The man his intake form would later identify him as Connor chuckled a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate in his chest. He nudged the guy next to him, a slightly leaner operator with cold, observant eyes. "Feisty. I like 'em feisty, Hayes." 10 minutes later, Fiona was standing on a metal step stool just to get proper leverage over Connor's bicep. The laceration was deep, an ugly, jagged tear that looked like it had been caused by jagged metal rather than a clean blade. She didn't ask how it happened. In this town, asking questions only resulted in practiced lies or smug silence. She snapped a pair of latex gloves over her hands, the sharp crack of the rubber echoing in the small room. Connor didn't even wince as she irrigated the wound with a blast of saline. Instead, he kept up a steady stream of obnoxious commentary performing for Hayes and the other 2 Briggs and Sullivan, who were lounging against the supply cabinets like they owned the hospital. "Careful there, little lady." Connor smirked, looking down at the top of Fiona's head. She barely crested 5'2". "You're squeezing a little hard. Don't want to pull a muscle. Do they make scrubs in child sizes, or did you have to special order those?" Briggs snorted from the corner. "Hey, back off, Con. She's doing her best. Probably her first time seeing real blood. Usually she just hands out band-aids to kids with scraped knees." Fiona felt a familiar, exhausting knot tighten in her stomach. She wasn't angry. Anger required energy she didn't possess. Instead, she felt a profound, cynical weariness. She hated their arrogance, yes, but she also recognized it. It was a flimsy shield. She knew what that kind of adrenaline did to a human soul. It hollowed you out, leaving behind only the bravado to mask the screaming void inside. She knew this because she used to live in that void. Before the hospital, before the scrubs, Before she realized she would rather spend her nights trying to plug holes in people than helping to create them, she dabbed the wound with a gauze pad, the rough texture catching on the torn edges of Connor's skin. "Hold still." She muttered, her voice flat, devoid of the bubbly bedside manner they likely expected. "I am still." Connor shot back, flexing his arm slightly, making the wound gape wider. "I'm like a rock. You're the one shaking." She wasn't shaking. Her hands were terrifyingly steady. It was one of the traits that had made her exceptional at her old job at Fort Meade. Signals intelligence, counter-terrorism desk. She had spent 5 years listening to the dying breaths of men across the globe, translating panicked whispers into coordinates, turning human lives into cold, hard data points on a glowing screen. She had burned out spectacularly, her mind fracturing under the weight of classified ghosts. Nursing was supposed to be her penance, a simple, grounded reality where the immediate goal was always preservation. But tonight, the ghosts were loud. Fiona prepped the suture kit, tearing open the sterile packaging with a sharp, practiced motion. She loaded the curved needle into the needle driver. "I can give you a local anesthetic." She offered, her tone strictly procedural. "Lidocaine. It'll sting for a second, but you won't feel the stitches." Connor laughed loudly, a grating, dismissive sound. "Lidocaine, please. Just sew it up, nurse. We don't have time for the soft stuff. We got places to be. Suit yourself," Fiona said. She didn't press the issue. If he wanted to feel the crunch of the needle tearing through his dermis, to prove a point to his buddies, that was his prerogative. She took a breath, anchoring her forearm against his to stabilize her wrist, and pushed the needle through the thick, tanned skin. Connor's jaw clenched. The muscles in his arm corded, twitching slightly under her touch, but he forced a grin. To distract himself, he turned his head to Hayes. "Seriously, though, if this little paper cut keeps me grounded tonight, the commander is going to lose his mind. We're already behind schedule." Hayes, who had been relatively quiet, shifting his weight uneasily against the supply cabinet, frowned. He cast a quick, paranoid glance at Fiona, assessing her threat level. Seeing only a diminutive, exhausted nurse focused entirely on tying a surgical knot, he relaxed a fraction. "Keep your voice down." Hayes murmured the reprimand, barely audible over the hum of the monitors. "We're fine. The bird doesn't leave the tarmac at Dam Neck until 0400. Fiona's fingers froze for a microsecond. Dam Neck, the naval base, specifically the home of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGRU. Tier 1. I know. Connor muttered, wincing slightly as Fiona pulled the nylon thread tight. But the pre-brief for Operation Sandstone was supposed to start 20 minutes ago. If we missed the sat-up link with the handlers... I said, "Shut up, Con." Hayes snapped, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a sudden razor-sharp edge. Fiona kept her eyes on the laceration. She snipped the thread. Operation Sandstone. The word settled into her brain like a stone dropped in a quiet pond, the ripples disturbing memories she had spent 3 years trying to bury. She shouldn't know that name. It was an active, compartmentalized objective. But the intelligence apparatus was a small, incestuous world. Her brother, currently sitting at a desk in Langley, had complained about the logistical nightmare of Sandstone over a secure, encrypted call just 2 days ago. It was a high-risk extraction in the Horn of Africa. A warlord had gotten his hands on stolen NATO comms equipment. The entire operation relied on complete, unbroken digital silence until the exact moment of breach. Fiona tied the final stitch. She wiped the dried blood from the periphery of the wound with a saline-soaked sponge. Connor let out a loud, dramatic sigh, rolling his shoulder. "Finally. Good work, kid. Try to get some sleep, yeah? You look like you're about to fall over. Leave the heavy lifting to the professionals tonight." He hopped off the exam table, towering over her, a smug, patronizing smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. Fiona stood there, the bloody gauze clutched in her gloved hand. She looked at Connor. Then she looked at Hayes. They were arrogant. They were sloppy. They were walking into a meat grinder, and they didn't even know the gears were already turning. Her brother had mentioned the localized chatter during their call. The warlord's perimeter guards had suddenly switched their radio frequencies. It was a tiny anomaly, but in the world of signals intelligence, a sudden shift in behavior meant someone had been tipped off. Fiona closed her eyes for a brief second. She told herself to let them walk out. It wasn't her world anymore. She was just a nurse. Her job ended when the bleeding stopped. But the visceral memory of a botched extraction 5 years ago, the static on the radio, the sudden frantic screaming, the horrifying silence that followed clawed at her throat. She couldn't let it happen again. Not when she held a piece of the puzzle. Connor turned to leave, tossing a crumpled paper towel toward the trash can, and missing. "Connor," Fiona said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with a sudden icy authority that hadn't been there a moment before. It was the voice of a handler. He paused, looking back over his shoulder, an amused eyebrow raised. "Yeah, Doc." Fiona didn't step back. She closed the distance between them, ignoring the massive size difference. She looked up, her tired, bloodshot eyes locking onto his. She didn't blink. She grabbed the collar of his t-shirt, her small, gloved fingers gripping the fabric with surprising strength, and pulled him down slightly. Connor stiffened, caught completely off guard by the physical contact. The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by sudden instinctual tension. The other 3 operators in the room went rigidly still, their casual posture evaporating in an instant. Fiona leaned in. She could smell the stale tobacco on his breath, feel the heat radiating off his skin. "Tell your commander at Dam Neck," she whispered, her voice a low, raspy vibration directly in his ear, "that the primary exfil for Sandstone is compromised. The target shifted frequencies to band 4 Bravo at 0200 hours. They know you're coming." Connor froze. The air in his lungs seemed to solidify. His eyes widened, staring blankly at the sterile white wall behind Fiona. The heart monitor attached to the bay's main screen, which still had his baseline vitals recorded, let out a rapid series of electronic chirps as his heart rate violently spiked. Fiona let go of his collar. She smoothed the front of her scrubs, her face an unreadable mask. "Keep the bandage dry," she added, her tone returning to the flat, bored cadence of an overworked ER nurse. "And take some ibuprofen for the swelling. Discharge papers are at the front desk." She turned her back on them, walking towards the sink to peel off her bloody gloves. Behind her, the trauma bay was dead silent. The cockiness, the bravado, the arrogant swagger, it had all vanished, sucked out of the room in a single, terrifying breath. Cold water hit the stainless steel basin of the sink with a harsh, drumming splash. Fiona aggressively pumped the cheap pink antiseptic soap into her palm, the harsh chemical smell of iodine and institutional cleaner flooding her nostrils. She scrubbed her skin until it turned a patchy, irritated red. She didn't look back. She could feel the sudden, suffocating weight of their stares boring into the space between her shoulder blades. The silence in Trauma Bay 3 was absolute, heavy and dense like water before a storm. The erratic beeping of the heart monitor had slowed, but Connor's breathing remained shallow and fast. "Close the door," a voice said. It wasn't Connor's booming, arrogant baritone. It was Hayes, low, even, dangerous. Fiona heard the heavy, rubberized tread of tactical boots shift across the linoleum, followed by the solid click of the heavy wooden door shutting, severing the room from the dull chaos of the main ER. The lock engaged with a sharp snap. She rinsed the suds from her hands, the water turning slightly pink from the residual blood on her knuckles, before swirling down the drain. She grabbed a rough paper towel, ripping it from the dispenser with a sharp, violent, tearing sound. Only then did she turn around. They had formed a perimeter. It was an instinctual maneuver drilled into their muscle memory. Briggs stood flush against the closed door, his arms crossed over his massive chest. his eyes fixed on the frosted glass window. Sullivan had flanked the triage cart, effectively blocking Fiona's path to the emergency call button. Connor was still by the exam table, rubbing his freshly sutured arm, looking at Fiona as if she had just morphed into an alien species. Hayes stood dead center. He had dropped the casual bored posture completely. His shoulders were squared, his chin tucked slightly, the universal stance of a man preparing for violence. He stared at Fiona, his eyes moving over her face, cataloguing her micro-expressions, searching for a tell. "Who do you work for?" Hayes asked. The question hung in the air, stripped of any polite civilian pretense. Fiona balled the damp paper towel in her fist. Her feet throbbed in her clogs. A headache, dull and throbbing, began to pulse at the base of her skull. She was so unbelievably tired. "I work for Virginia Beach, General." Fiona said, her voice dry. She tossed the paper towel into the biohazard bin. It landed with a soft, hollow thud. "And my shift ended 20 minutes ago. You guys are keeping me from my bed." Hayes didn't blink. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. The air between them seemed to compress. "Don't play games with me. You just casually dropped a Tier 1 mission codename, an extraction route, and a localized frequency shift happening halfway across the world. You're not a nurse. I have the student loan debt that says otherwise." Fiona shot back. She crossed her arms, anchoring her feet to the floor. She refused to let him intimidate her. She had dealt with men exactly like Hayes for years, men who thought physical presence could bully digital reality. "Your bandage is on. You have your post-op instructions. Unlock my door." Not until you explain how a civilian knows about sandstone." Connor interjected, his voice tight, stripped of the cocky veneer. He looked physically ill, the adrenaline crash hitting him simultaneously with the realization of his own compromised mortality. "If that intel is right, we were walking straight into a kill box. You were—" Fiona stated simply. She looked at Connor, devoid of pity. "If they switch to 4 Bravo, it means they've synced their perimeter radios with a hardline localized radar. They're no longer broadcasting over the airwaves you're monitoring. They went dark to listen for you. The second your Blackhawks crested the ridge, they would have painted you with anti-aircraft fire. You'd be burning wreckage before your boots ever touched the dirt." Hayes sucked in a breath through his teeth, a sharp, hissing sound. He looked at Briggs. Briggs gave a barely perceptible nod, confirming what they all knew. The tactical assessment was flawless. It was exactly the kind of trap a desperate warlord would set if tipped off. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Hayes said, his voice dropping another fraction, the threat lingering just beneath the syllables. "Who are you?" Fiona uncrossed her arms and let out a long, shuddering sigh. She hated this. She hated the adrenaline, the paranoia, the cold, calculating mathematics of war. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, her fingers pressing into the tired flesh around her eyes. "NSA Fort Meade. Signals Intelligence Counterterrorism Desk. 5 years." She muttered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. She didn't mention her brother. In this world, you protected your sources even if your source was family complaining about logistics over an encrypted line. I tracked ghost frequencies in the Horn of Africa. I learned how those warlords communicate, how they hide, and how they set traps. I got out 3 years ago because I was tired of watching men like you die on satellite feeds. Hayes scrutinized her. The hostility in his posture dialed back a fraction, replaced by intense professional calculation. "If you're out, how do you know the frequency shifted at 0200 hours? Fiona stared at the sterile white tiles of the wall behind him. She could smell the stale sweat drying on their tactical shirts. "I still have friends. Friends who complain about their jobs when they're stressed. Friends who mentioned a sudden, localized comms blackout in a sector they were monitoring for a DevGru op. It doesn't take a genius to put the pieces together when 4 operators walk into my ER smelling like damp neoprene an hour before a flight to the Horn. Hayes stood perfectly still for 5 agonizing seconds. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across his face. Then, without taking his eyes off Fiona, he reached into the cargo pocket of his tactical pants and pulled out a heavy black encrypted satellite phone. "Hold the perimeter," Hayes ordered Briggs and Sullivan. He keyed in a complex passcode, his thumb moving with practiced, rapid precision. He lifted the thick plastic device to his ear. Fiona watched the muscles in his jaw clench and unclench as he waited for the secure connection to route through the military servers. "Actual, this is Echo 3. Hayes said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We have a potential compromise on Sandstone. Request immediate verification of target comms protocol." He paused, listening to the tiny, distorted voice bleeding through the earpiece. "I don't care if the bird is spinning up. Check the localized frequencies, specifically band 4 Bravo. Did the target go dark at 0200? The room descended into a suffocating silence. Connor stared at the floor, a single bead of sweat tracking down the side of his neck, catching the harsh hospital light. Fiona leaned her hip against the stainless steel counter, exhaustion settling deep into her bones, making her joints ache. She had opened the door she had sworn to keep locked. The ghosts were back, crowding the small trauma bay, smelling of cordite and impending violence. Hayes listened. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Slowly, the color drained from Hayes's face, leaving him looking as sickly and pale as the linoleum beneath their feet. He closed his eyes, a heavy, ragged exhale escaping his nose. "Understood." Hayes murmured into the phone. "Abort the primary exfil. We need a secondary route drafted before we leave Dam Neck. Echo 3 out." He lowered the phone. The device looked incredibly heavy in his hand. He looked up at Fiona. The cold, assessing predator was gone. In his eyes, Fiona saw the raw, terrifying vulnerability of a man who had just peered over the edge of his own grave. "You were right," Hayes said, his voice hollow, stripping away any lingering skepticism. The words seemed to physically cost him. Command just pinged the NSA's real-time feed. The Warlord's entire grid went completely silent at exactly 0203 hours. They shifted to a closed-loop system on 4 Bravo. They were waiting for us. Briggs let out a low, profane curse, his head thumping back against the frosted glass of the door. Sullivan rubbed a hand roughly over his face, the sound of his calloused palm scraping against his 5 o'clock shadow, loud in the quiet room. Connor looked at Fiona. The arrogant giant who had mockingly asked for child-sized scrubs just 20 minutes ago now looked incredibly small. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. You just saved our lives." Fiona didn't feel a rush of heroic triumph. She didn't feel vindicated or proud. She just felt a deep, hollow sadness. She looked at the bloody gauze sitting in the biohazard bin, at the discarded suture wrappings on the tray. It was all just a temporary fix. She had stopped the bleeding tonight, but they were still going to get on that plane. They were still flying into the dark. "I didn't save your lives." Fiona said, her voice barely above a whisper, raw and lacking any inflection. "I just delayed the inevitable. You're still going to go." "That's the job," Hayes replied quietly. He slipped the sat phone back into his pocket. His posture straightened, the military stoicism returning, a necessary armor against the reality of their existence. "We pivot. We find a new route. We execute." Fiona pushed off the counter. She walked slowly towards the triage cart, her body heavy, dragging. She pulled a fresh pair of purple nitrile gloves from the cardboard box. They snapped against her wrists, a sharp, familiar sound. If they shifted to a closed-loop system, Fiona said, not looking at them, focusing instead on organizing the sterile instruments on the tray. "They are relying on the Northern Ridge repeaters to bounce their signal. It's the only way to maintain a closed grid in that terrain." Hayes paused, stepping closer to her. "What are you saying?" Fiona finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "I'm saying the northern route is dead. They have eyes on the ridge. If your secondary exfil is north, tell your commander to scrap it. Go south, through the wadi. It's a logistical nightmare. It's muddy, and the extraction bird won't be able to land. You'll have to rope out, but the rock formations in the wadi create a natural dead zone for Band 4 Bravo. They won't be able to track your comms, and their radar can't penetrate the canyon walls." Hayes stared at her, absorbing the tactical intelligence. He wasn't questioning her anymore. He was treating her like an asset, a lifeline. He gave a single slow nod. "South through the wadi. Copy that." He turned to his men. The dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. There was no more swagger, no more jokes, just the grim, heavy reality of the work ahead. "Briggs, unlock the door. We're moving," Hayes ordered. Briggs turned the deadbolt. The heavy clack echoed loudly. He pulled the door open, letting the chaotic noise of the emergency room flood back into the sterile bay. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed less oppressive, drowned out by the distant sound of a paging system and rolling gurneys. Sullivan filed out, first followed by Briggs. Connor lingered for a moment. He looked at Fiona, his massive frame shifting awkwardly in the doorway. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of profound thanks, or maybe another apology for his earlier behavior. Fiona held up a gloved hand, stopping him. "Take the ibuprofen, Connor. Change the dressing in 24 hours. Keep it clean." Connor's jaw tightened. He understood. She didn't want his gratitude. She didn't want to be a part of their story. He gave her a sharp, respectful nod, the kind usually reserved for a commanding officer, and stepped out into the hallway, disappearing into the chaotic flow of the hospital. Hayes was the last one left. He stood in the doorway, blocking the harsh glare of the hallway lights. He looked at the small, exhausted nurse standing amidst the medical waste, her shoulders slumped, her eyes vacant. "I don't know who your source is," Hayes said quietly, ensuring his voice didn't carry into the hall. "But tell them thank you." Fiona picked up a disinfectant wipe. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a nurse who reads too much military fiction." The ghost of a smile touched the corner of Hayes's mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Right. Have a good night, Doc." He turned and walked away, his heavy boots making no sound on the linoleum. Fiona watched him go until he rounded the corner, vanishing from sight. She stood alone in Trauma Bay 3 for a long time. The silence returned, settling over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She looked at the blood on the floor, Connor's blood. She looked at the discarded medical supplies. The smell of copper and bleach was overpowering. Her radio cracked to life, the dispatcher's voice tinny and rushed. "Incoming trauma. 5 minutes out. MVC 2 victims, severe lacerations. Bay 3, are you clear?" Fiona closed her eyes. The ache in her feet flared, shooting up her calves. The ghosts of the Horn of Africa receded, pushed back into the dark corners of her mind by the immediate screaming demands of the present. The adrenaline left her system in a sudden sickening rush, leaving her dizzy and hollow. She keyed the mic on her shoulder. "Bay 3 is clear," she said, her voice steady, flat, and professional. She grabbed the mop bucket from the corner. She wrung out the sponge, the dirty water splashing against the plastic sides. She had blood to clean up. The adrenaline rush doesn't end when the mission does. It lingers in the quiet, sterile halls of the ER. If Fiona's intense, grounded standoff kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to show your support. Share this gritty, realistic story with fellow thriller fans who appreciate true suspense over cliché heroics. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep, character-driven military dramas that hit right at the heart. Stay tuned for our next drop.